Hi, I'm Meredith Cohen. I'm an architectural historian specialized in medieval architecture. Today, I'll be breaking down for you some of the most famous castles from the Disney films. First up, we're going to look at the Queen's Castle from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, one of Disney's earliest movies made in 1937. On the left, we see the village. The little houses are sort of being completely overtaken by that huge castle up above. That kind of must allude to how scary, this evil queen was. This castle is based on the Alcazar of Segovia in Spain. It was in the middle of a civil war that was initiated and won by Francisco Franco, the dictator who took over Spain for many, many years. And that also may connote this evil dictatorial queen. So that's the inspiration for what we're looking at here. First thing that jumps out at me is really the silhouette and the towers. With a very triangular profile, what's interesting is that we have a kind of progression in time in this castle from early round arch gated opening to a keep, typical 1200, and then to these added turrets and towers, which really come into castle architecture when castles are being used more for residential and reception purposes. There's just a myriad and all these turrets and towers that give it a really magical feel and also elevated, give it this sort of uplifting vertical quality, adding that little Disney magic. Many of those wouldn't have existed in a real original castle. They were really for moving around the castle. They had spiral staircases in them. Here we know that the exaggeration of towers and turrets is something that Disney's added to their castle to kind of give it that more magical fantasy-like feel. We don't even see a walkway up to the gateway there. It's like the castle's really set apart from the village. She's isolated, and then all this stone. They are usually on a craggy promontory like this, just so that they're visible from afar and so that they're isolated from any enemies. Very difficult to access. Makes it seem all the more kind of scarier. I noticed really small windows, some on the side here, and that's pretty accurate because generally castles don't have big windows. They're defensive structures. At most, they'll have what we call arrow loops, where you can fit your bow into and defend the castle from these thin arrow loops. This castle is based on a square inner core and is very compact. That's very typical for early castles that have evolved from towers or keeps, and these square ones are just a larger version of the castle keep. Disney was still figuring out its castle style, so they haven't quite coined all of the different elements in the typical Disney castle and in the Disney logo. Next, we're going to be looking at King Stephan's Castle from Sleeping Beauty. Here's what jumps out at me. I see a multi-turreted castle. This castle was inspired by the Bavarian castle Neuschwanstein, which was built by King Ludwig of Bavaria in the 1860s, almost neo-Gothic revival style. Gothic really was built in the 13th and 14th centuries, so he's building, 400 years later in the same style. Neuschwanstein shows a kind of nostalgia and a kind of romantic idealization of the past, and that's exactly what King Ludwig II was going for. He wanted to relive those glory days. He also wanted the castle to look very magical and special. Many of the towers have battlements with crenellations, and they're capped by finials that extend the eye upward into the skyline. These two turrets have a kind of brace in between them. In a structural way, could help them stand up. This tower in the middle here is articulated with tracery, and it's got wood battlements projecting out as opposed to stone ones. So the turrets are all from kind of different time periods. This is more of a Gothic turret. This is more of a Renaissance-style turret. This looks like the Scandinavian type of gabled turret. In the front, we have this kind of forecourt, or we would call that a barbican, a little mini fortress in front of a main fortress. So this kind of looks like an adaptation of a barbican there. And within it, we see these cross-shaped, those would be arrow loops. And then to the left, we have a kind of veranda on this double pointed arch spaceway. The pointed arches would suggest that this was built in the Gothic period, anywhere from about 1140 to about 1450. The addition of all these towers and turrets here would suggest a later time period. Renaissance castle, making it more attractive and inviting to come into. Here, I see a tight space between this wall and the actual castle. Normally, there would be much more space in between. That space is called a bailey. It's just space to maneuver your troops and your horses and to move people around the different parts of the castle. This castle here became the prototype for many of Disney's subsequent films in which a castle is featured. And the Disney logo is a combination of two different castles, Cinderella's castle and Sleeping Beauty's castle. They both have this kind of triangular composition with towers and turrets, bringing your eyes upward, giving it an extra fantastic and magical quality. And the triangular silhouette of the Disney logo is something that we see featured in many castles in Disney films. The next castle we're looking at is Corona Castle, that's featured in the movie Tangled. First thing that jumps out at me is that Disney is once again using the Cinderella prototype of castle. Here we have this triangular composition with tall towers leading the eye upward, and they're capped by these bronze-colored domes with pinnacles or finials on top of them. We have a kind of Gothic projection sticking out there, Gothic church-like shape there. Here's more of a castle structure at the foundation, and then below we see the houses of the village that are made of wood. And the whole thing is on this island in the middle of flat, rippling water, and we can see galleons to the side, very large kind of ships. So that water must be very, very deep. We have a kind of bridgeway or causeway to this island that also must be very deep. Foundations underneath the bridge. It's not very realistic. It is typical for castles to be built in stone because that is the most expensive building material. So it's very normal that we would see little houses being built of wood below because wood didn't cost as much. These are kind of typical what we call timber trussed houses. This castle breaks with the Disney tradition because there is no front and center causeway going up, inviting the viewer into the castle. It's pushed off to the side here by this bridge. Otherwise, it's on this island that is surrounded by water, therefore makes it very, very difficult to access. This particular castle was clearly inspired by Mont Saint-Michel. It's a little island off of Normandy in France. It actually was a Benedictine abbey founded in 708. Many different additions were made to the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel, and the upper part of it today is a combination of Romanesque and Gothic features. So they're actually using a church as a kind of castle inspiration here. Mont Saint-Michel is so perfect for Tangled because it's an island. The tides go in and out, and you can only access this space twice a day in real life, Mont Saint-Michel, at low tide. Over time, Mont Saint-Michel became a prison in the 19th century, so that must refer in some way to Rapunzel, who was locked up in a prison, and then she would throw her hair out when she wanted her suitor to come meet her and then bring it back in. So it's like the tides going out and in were like Rapunzel's hair being thrown out and in. This castle is an excellent example of incorporating a structure into the story. Next up is the Castle Dunbroch from the movie Brave. So this is a stone castle. What's interesting is that it actually looks very kind of run down and old. This suggests that this castle has been around for a really, really long time. This story, Brave, is actually supposed to be set in the 10th century, but we know that castles were only built in stone from the 11th century on. What's also a little bit odd is that if you're living in a castle, you don't let it fall into ruin while you're living in it. We have an entryway into this gatehouse Normally that would be a fortified gatehouse with a portcullis, which is an iron grill that can come down for defensive purposes here. And we have this kind of trodden path that looks kind of old and there's no closure. And then what are these stairs on the side and where do they go? They don't seem to go directly to the gatehouse. Here we're looking at a battlement, which is a corbelled out superstructure on the keep here. It's used for defensive purposes. It allows those who are on top of the battlement to throw stones, to defend themselves. We can see some crenellations, and a crenellation is that tooth formation where you have a merlin sticking up, and then the crenel is that low part. The merlin can be used as a kind of shield when people are throwing things at you from afar and you need to defend your castle. So you would hide behind the merlin, and then you would move into the crenel to throw your rocks or shoot your arrows. So this castle is very run down. We may refer to an aspect in the story where the four clans are at odds with each other and they need to be reunited and brought together. They're dysfunctional, like the castle. The family lives inside this keep here, and this one actually has 0 windows. And it's normal that a keep would have no windows because they're made for siege warfare. But there would be spaces for air, and there would be arrow loops so that people could defend themselves from inside. We do have this curtain wall and this open space within it for activities, repairing your horse spurs or workmen's stalls inside this area to prepare those to go out. This castle is said to be inspired by 2 real Scottish castles. Island Donan is one of them, and Donatar Castle. They're both very old castles with somewhat horizontal profile as this one has, with its gatehouse and the curtain walls and the keep on the left in this isolated position. This is the most realistic of the Disney castles I've seen so far. Let's take a look now at the Sultan's Palace in Aladdin. So what I'm looking at here is a palace that is modeled on the Cinderella style with that kind of triangular profile and many turrets, but really what jumps out is this huge onion dome at the top of the central tower, and then the multiplication of those throughout the space of this castle here. I've never seen a real castle like this. This one also has a processional staircase that moves up into an arched doorway or portal. It's based on a pointed arch, which can refer to an Islamic arch. This one looks more Gothic to me, but the pointed arch is believed to have been actually created in Islamic architecture. We have one more of those supporting buttresses that keep the towers braced and standing up, so that's unusual. And then the whole thing stands on this kind of platform here, and there are these sort of large bases for these towers. The door is turquoise, so that does remind me of architecture in India that's very colorful and often has this kind of turquoise color. And so they're collapsing kind of Islamic and Hindu architecture. The Sultan's Palace is based on the Taj Mahal of India, which was built by the Mughal emperor Shah Jahan, starting in 1632. It was built for his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal. The Taj Mahal actually is a mausoleum. It's where her tomb lies and where his tomb lies as well. Sultan's Palace is a kind of caricature of the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is made of white marble with inlaid different colored stones, super refined. And this one, it's hard to tell. Maybe they're alluding to the white marble of the Taj Mahal, but it kind of looks like, just stone plastered over. It's hard to know what the material of these onion domes are. They're alluding to bronze, having them be bronze domes, but then they're so exaggerated. I think that it's just too big and it would be too heavy, and it's very unlikely that the tower below could support this. And then you see some detailing here underneath that almost looks like a kind of Islamic bracelet with all that fine gold filigree work. But with these onion domes, it reminds me more of St. Basil's Cathedral in the Kremlin than it really does of the Taj Mahal, because the Taj Mahal really only has that one central dome. And it has 4 minarets, which are just towers to call prayers from. So these here aren't minarets at all. It really looks more like this kind of Russian Orthodox church architecture. So they're collapsing a lot of different cultures into one thing here. They do have a note in front of their film now acknowledging that it was made from a different time, and collapsing of so many different cultures into one thing would be considered offensive. It was Disney's first attempt to create a non-Western castle, and they really took some liberties here in the cultures they pulled from to make this a kind of magical and fantastic Disney castle. Let's take a look now at Arendelle from the movie Frozen. Again, that Cinderella prototype of that triangular composition of a castle, surrounded by walls here, an extension into a kind of jetty. The main castle inside has many gables. In the center, this would be a bell tower, capped by a kind of spire. Frozen is based off a kind of Scandinavian legend. This outer fortification structure is referring to Akerhus Fort near Oslo in Norway. And it does have vertical stone wall quality. The castle, the actual residence on the inside, this wood building, first of all, that we're looking at. So that's a real difference from all the other castles we've looked at. This one is wood. You can see the different timber trusses there, crossing vertically and horizontally. We have 3 gables ascending to that top bell tower. And that reminds me a lot of these Norwegian stave churches, such as the one at Borgund. Borgund is a stave church built of wood in the 1200s. It's extraordinary that it still stands today. A stave is a kind of wood panel that has interlocking grooves holding them together. And this hybrid structure is the combination of the fortress, and then they've adapted the church structure as a kind of fantastic looking palace on the inside. They do that because churches are often the most exciting architecture in the Middle Ages. They're the most beautiful. And Scandinavia, or in Norway, they are very breathtaking. This window here, made as a kind of triangle, and it has some ice tracery on the inside there. That's not at all accurate. And this long wall is very unusual. It almost reminds me of the Great Wall of China that goes over all the hills and valleys. So that's unusual. A wall would demarcate territory, and it's also there for defense and safekeeping, right? To keep people inside or to mark a boundary. This wall is more like a rampart. It almost looks like you can walk in between those 2 edges there, and then it has a tower. I'm not really sure what the function is. It's just adding to this kind of, fantastic setting. Another view of Arendelle has us looking at a very symmetrical curtain wall with a gate in the middle of it and a processional route going straight up to it. It's very unlike a medieval castle, which is a defensive structure and would not want people just processing straight into the middle of it. So the Scandinavian architecture that we're looking at here reflects the origins of this story, which is a Scandinavian myth. So those are the architectural details I noticed in the Disney castles. Let me know what you think in the comments.